The desert does not forgive. It does not soften its edges for the weary, does not shade its glare for the lost, and does not offer comfort to those who arrive with nothing but a carpet bag and a brass compass worn smooth from years of anxious handling. The desert simply is vast, indifferent, and ancient in ways that make human suffering feel very small. Indeed, May Calloway had not expected comfort. She had stopped expecting it 8 years ago, on the day they lowered her father into the cold Ohio ground, and her uncle Harlan Briggs placed one firm hand on her 12-year-old shoulder and said without looking down at her, "You'll come live with us then." Not a question, not an offer, a ledger entry being made in real time. But none of that was what May was thinking about on the morning of September 14th, 1889. When the stagecoach crested the low ridge above the dry well basin, and the driver called out the town's name in a voice that suggested he was glad to be rid of it. May was thinking about the thing she could see rising from the white salt flat below, the impossible, enormous, world-ending thing that no one on earth had thought to warn her about. She pressed her face close to the dusty window glass. It rose from the desert floor like something from a fever dream. A steamship. Not a small one, not a modest river packet, but a full-sized 5-deck palace of a vessel, the kind that had once carried wealthy passengers up and down the great western rivers in a blaze of gaslight and orchestra music. Its twin smokestacks pointed straight at the sky like two black fingers making an accusation no one could answer. Its white paint, what remained of it, had bleached to the color of old bone. Its name, still barely legible in flaking gold leaf along the bow, read Starlight Queen, and it was sinking. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a slow geological certainty that made it all the more unsettling. The bottom 2 decks had been swallowed entirely by the earth, consumed by the cracked clay pan of the dry riverbed over 2 decades of relentless desert heat. The ship had not fallen over. It had simply been pulled down inch by inch, year by year, until it stood half buried in the desert like a monument to something no one could quite name. From 10 miles out, you could see it. From the ridge above town, it looked like God had tried to plant a steamship and given up halfway through. May did not look away. The other passengers shifted and murmured. A heavy-set man in a brown suit muttered something about "that damned folly," and returned to his newspaper. A woman with a sleeping child on her lap glanced at the ship, then at May's face, and then quickly away, as though she had seen something too private to witness. May kept her eyes on the ship until the stagecoach descended into the basin and the rooftops of Drywell swallowed it from view. Then she sat back, her carpet-bag on her knees, her father's compass in her right hand, and she thought, "There it is." She did not know yet what she meant by that, but she felt it the way you feel a thing before you have the language for it, like the pressure change before a storm, like the moment before a clock strikes and you already know the hour. The story of how May Calloway came to be sitting in a stagecoach with $5 in her pocket and a compass that had seen better days requires going back 8 years to a Tuesday in October of 1881, when a boiler explosion on the river steamer Helena Grace killed 4 men and sent May's father, Robert Calloway, to a grave in Denton, Ohio. Robert had been a riverboat engineer, which was not merely a job, but a calling. He was a man who spoke in the language of tolerances and pressures of gasket seats and piston clearances, of the precise and beautiful arithmetic that kept a machine alive and moving against a current. His hands were always slightly stained with machine oil, no matter how hard he scrubbed, and he smelled of hot metal and coal smoke, and he could make any broken thing work again, given enough time and the right tools. He had started teaching May when she was 6 years old, not because she asked, not because it was expected, but because he saw in his daughter the same particular quality. He had recognized in himself a mind that needed to understand how things worked. Not just that they worked, but the mechanism beneath the elegant logic of cause and effect, the satisfaction of a system functioning exactly as it was designed to. He showed her how to seat a gasket so it would never leak. He taught her the feel of a well-balanced flywheel and the sound a bearing made when it was failing. He let her hold the micrometer herself, let her take the measurements, let her be wrong and correct herself. He gave her his brass compass when she was 10. "So you always know you're heading, May," he said, his voice a low rumble that she could feel in her chest when she stood close to him. "Even when the river bends." She carried it everywhere after that. She was carrying it the day they told her he was gone. There were no other family members to consider. Not really. Her mother had died of consumption when May was 4, leaving behind only a vague impression of lavender and a gentle hand, a memory more felt than seen. Robert's only living relative was his older brother, Harlan Briggs, a merchant in Denton, a man of accounts and inventories. And so May was sent to live in the large, orderly house on Merchant Street, where everything had a value and everything was accounted for. Harlan Briggs was not a cruel man. That was the thing that made it harder in some ways. Cruelty you could push against. Cruelty had heat in it, and where there is heat, there is at least acknowledgement. Harlan was simply cold. He was a man who had organized his world into 2 categories, assets and liabilities, and had long since stopped questioning whether that was a sufficient way to understand a life. He took May in because it was the correct thing to do, which was also the proper business decision, since it cost less socially to take in a niece than to refuse. He put her in the small attic room at the top of the house. He enrolled her in the local school. And when he discovered about a year into the arrangement that she had a sharp and reliable mind for numbers, he began putting her to work in his mercantile. She swept floors. She stocked shelves. She learned to take inventory with the kind of methodical thoroughness that made his permanent bookkeeper, old Mr. Dunn, quietly redundant. By the time May was 15, she was keeping Harlan's accounts with a precision and neatness that saved him the cost of 2 hired clerks. He paid her nothing. She was family after all. Family did not invoice. She never complained. She never asked for more than she was given, which was food, a room, and the occasional cast-off dress from her cousin Fordham's fiancée's charity pile. But in the evenings after the house went quiet, and the lamp on her nightstand threw its small circle of yellow light across the sloped ceiling, May would unroll her father's engineering schematics, intricate hand-drawn diagrams of steam engines and paddle wheel assemblies, and she would study them. She kept them rolled inside a length of oilcloth, tied with a bit of worn twine, and she handled them with the particular care you give to things that are irreplaceable. The compass lived in her apron pocket. Its weight was a constant. On her hardest days, she would close her hand around it and feel the cool brass against her palm, and remember that her father had once believed she was someone who needed to know her own direction. 8 years passed in this way. Quiet, methodical, self-contained. May learned 2 languages in that house, the language of machines from her father's schematics, and her own careful study, and the language of commerce from Harlan's ledgers and the daily operations of the store. She understood profit margins and load-bearing tolerances with equal fluency. She understood the precise value of a well-seated valve and the precise value of a quarterly inventory. She understood both, and she let neither define her, and she waited with the patience of someone who has learned that patience is not the same as surrender for whatever came next. What came next arrived on a Tuesday morning in September of 1889, when Harlan called her into his office, stood behind his desk, clasped his hands behind his back, and looked at a point on the wall just above her shoulder. Fordham was getting married. His fiancée, Eleanor Voss, was of good family and would be taking over the household management. May's room would be needed. Her bookkeeping services would no longer be required. He had prepared a settlement. He slid an envelope across the desk. $75. He called it generous. He said the words in the tone of a man who has resolved an accounting discrepancy to everyone's satisfaction. May looked at the envelope. She looked at his face. She found no malice there, no guilt, no flicker of anything that might be mistaken for affection. He was closing a line item. She had always known it would come to this, not with cruelty, but with the quiet administrative finality of a book being balanced. She did not plead. She did not argue. She nodded once, said, "I understand," and took the envelope. But before she went upstairs to pack her carpet bag, 2 dresses, her underclothes, her father's schematics in their oilcloth, her small accumulated kit of tools, she did one last thing. She opened the ledger that sat on the edge of Harlan's desk, the master account book she had maintained for 3 years, and she turned to the page where household expenses were recorded. She ran her finger down the column until she found her name. It appeared once, in a column labeled Operating Costs. There was no malice in it. That was the thing. There was no entry for the 8 years she had given, no acknowledgement of the precision and care she had brought to every page of that book. No accounting for what it had actually cost her to make herself so useful and so invisible. She was listed as an expense, not as a person, not as a niece, not as the daughter of the man who had once been his brother. An expense, an item to be managed and eventually reconciled. May closed the ledger. She set it back on the desk exactly as she had found it. She went upstairs and packed her bag. She left the quilt on the bed. She left the book on the nightstand. She paused at the bottom of the stairs to look at the family portraits on the wall, Harlan and his wife, their children, their children's children, an orderly genealogy of belonging. Her father was not among them. By extension, neither was she. It was as if they had both simply never existed in this house at all. She closed the front door behind her without a sound. The compass was in her pocket. It was the only thing she was certain of. She had not planned to go west. She had not. If she was honest, planned anything at all beyond getting far enough away from Denton, Ohio, to breathe air that did not carry the particular smell of Harlan Briggs's leather-bound ledgers, and the particular quiet of a house where you are housed, but never home. The stagecoach west departed on Thursday. May bought her ticket at the station office with $14 of her $75, which left her $61, which was not enough to start much of anything, and she knew it. She sat in the waiting room with her carpet bag between her feet and her compass in her hand, and she turned it slowly, watching the needle find its bearing with the kind of patient certainty she was trying to summon in herself. It was on the notice board in the station waiting room that she saw the handbill. It was not a grand advertisement. It was a modest, somewhat faded single sheet printed on cheap paper advertising unclaimed properties in Drywell, Nevada, a township founded in anticipation of a navigable river that had, through some geological caprice, changed course, and then dried up entirely in 1868, leaving the settlement without its reason for existing. The notice mentioned parcels available at back tax prices. It mentioned the dry climate and the opportunities for commerce along the survey routes. It did not mention the ship. Nothing in the advertisement mentioned the ship, but the name lodged itself in May's mind. Drywell. A place named for its own fundamental failure. A place defined by what it had lost. She bought a connecting ticket. I see. 3 days in the stagecoach made a person philosophical whether they wanted to be or not. The Nevada landscape did not offer distraction. It offered only itself, the vast, flat sameness of the basin, the bleached earth, the sky so blue and enormous it seemed to press down rather than lift up. Dust came through every gap in the coach's frame and settled in the back of the throat, and the corners of the eyes and the other passengers retreated into their private miseries, and May sat by her window and watched the horizon and thought. She thought about her father the way she always thought about him, not with the sharp grief of early loss, which had softened now into something more like a low, permanent ache, but with a kind of active remembrance, as if keeping him clear in her mind was itself a form of honoring him. She thought about the schematics rolled in her bag. She thought about what he had believed, that the world was a magnificent machine, and that understanding how it worked was its own kind of reverence. She thought about the compass. Specifically, she thought about why he had given it to her, and not to Harlan, who was his brother, and who had remained alive and present while Robert went downriver to make his living. She thought maybe she understood now. Harlan had never needed to know his heading, because Harlan had never intended to go anywhere. He had built himself a fixed point and called it success. Her father had known somehow that his daughter would be different, that she would need to move, and that moving would require knowing which way was north. On the second day, somewhere east of the Nevada border, the woman with the sleeping child offered May half a biscuit and a piece of hard cheese, and May accepted it with genuine gratitude, and they sat in a comfortable silence for an hour, watching the terrain change from brown to white. No names were exchanged. Sometimes kindness didn't need them. On the third day, the driver called out Drywell, and the stagecoach crested the ridge, and May saw the Starlight Queen for the first time. Chate, The land office of Drywell occupied a single room in a low adobe building on the town's main street, which was wide and salt-dusted and largely empty in the mid-morning heat. A faded wooden sign above the door read, "Drywell Territorial Land Office, C. Drummond Agent." Cecil Drummond was a slight ink-stained man of about 50, with a green eye shade pulled low, and the general demeanor of someone who had been mildly surprised by most of what life had presented him. He looked up from his ledger when May pushed open the door, and the surprise that crossed his face was the specific kind reserved for women traveling alone in desert territories, not disapproving exactly, but uncertain, as if the social category she represented had not yet been fully catalogued. "Help you, miss?" he asked. "I'd like to inquire about the unclaimed properties," May said. Her voice was steady. She had been practicing steady for 8 years. Specifically, the steamship. The surprise on Cecil Drummond's face completed a full evolution from mild curiosity through genuine puzzlement to something that resolved inevitably into a smile that was 1 part amusement and 2 parts disbelief. "The Buried Queen," he said, leaning back in his chair with the proprietary satisfaction of a man about to tell a very good joke. "Miss, that isn't a property. That's a cautionary tale. She's been sitting in that clay flat since June of 1868. River went, ship stayed. Every year she sinks about another ½ inch. Another decade she'll be nothing but smokestacks." "Is there a deed?" May said. Drummond blinked. "Is it for sale?" she pressed. He pulled himself forward in his chair, shaking his head faintly in the manner of a man humoring someone. He is not sure how to categorize. He opened a large wooden file box and began shuffling through papers that crackled at the edges with age and dryness. "Let's see," he muttered to himself. "Starlight Queen. Starlight. Here." He squinted at a document so old it had faded to the color of tea. "Property of the defunct Saltwash Steam Navigation Company. Wait, no county absorbed her in." He ran his finger down a column of figures. 21 years of back taxes, total due, including accrued interest and processing fees. He looked up. $70. May put her carpetbag on the floor. She opened the small inner pocket she had sewn herself for specifically this purpose, and she laid 7 crisp $10 notes on the desk in front of Cecil Drummond. He looked at the money for a long time. He looked at her. He looked at the money again. "You're serious?" he said. "I'd like the deed, please," May said. Drummond picked up his pen with the slow deliberateness of a man who suspects he will be telling this story for the rest of his life and wants to make sure he gets the details right. He filled in the transfer of ownership in his scratchy, unhurried hand. He sanded the ink. He stamped it with a heavy brass seal that left a satisfying impression in the paper. He pushed the document across the desk. "She's yours," he said. "Hull boilers, paddle wheels. 5 decks, the grand ballroom with its original crystal chandeliers, what's left of them, and all the dust and silence therein." He paused. "Good luck to you, miss. Genuinely." May folded the deed and placed it in her bag. She picked up her carpetbag. She walked out of the office into the white midday heat of Drywell, Nevada, and she turned toward the shape on the horizon, and she began to walk toward it. She was the legal owner of the largest, most useless object in the entire Great Basin. She had $5 left. She did not slow down. Up close, the Starlight Queen was even more extraordinary than distance had suggested. May had grown up with her father's accounts of the great river steamers, the floating palaces of the Mississippi and the Ohio, the vessels that had carried cotton kings and politicians, and entire generations of hopeful migrants in gilded, lamp-lit splendor. She had studied their mechanics in his schematics, had memorized the layout of their engine rooms and the configuration of their boilers, had traced the lines of their paddle wheel assemblies, with her finger in the evenings, imagining the sound they would make against moving water. She had never seen one in person, and she had certainly never imagined seeing one like this. The Starlight Queen had been a grand vessel, even by the standards of her era. 400 feet long, designed to carry 200 passengers in first-class comfort, she had featured a ballroom on her upper deck with floor-to-ceiling windows of imported glass, a dining room with mahogany paneling and gas lamp chandeliers, a promenade deck from which wealthy passengers could watch the river slide past at a leisurely 15 miles per hour. She had been in 1858 the most elegant vessel operating west of the Missouri. Now she was half a monument and half a geological feature. The lower two decks, the engine deck and the main passenger deck, had been consumed by the earth, entirely swallowed down into the cracked clay basin, leaving the upper three decks standing free, and the twin smokestacks rising to a height that made May's neck ache to look up at. The hull, where it emerged from the ground, was a study in what 21 years of desert sun and alkaline dust could do to timber and iron, the wood bleached gray, the iron pitted and streaked with long rust stains like old wounds, the name along the bow barely visible beneath decades of weathering. The gangplank miraculously was still in place, weathered to the color of driftwood, listing slightly to the left, but structurally intact, held by iron chains that had oxidized to a deep reddish brown. May tested it with 1 foot before committing her weight. The wood groaned, but held. She climbed. The main deck. What had been 21 years ago. The third deck from the bottom was a wide open promenade lined with cabin doors, most of them hanging open on failing hinges or simply missing altogether. Dust lay so thick on the planking that May's boots left clear prints with each step, a trail of her passage through something that had been untouched for so long it had begun to forget it had ever been touched at all. Through the broken windows of the grand saloon, she could see the shadows of furniture, still in place. Chairs that had once been velvet-covered, now gray with age, a long dining table with the china service still set, as though the last passengers had simply stepped away for a moment and never come back. She moved through it carefully, cataloging her engineer's mind, taking in structural conditions, noting the places where rot had weakened the planking, the areas where the deck was sound, the distribution of weight and stress. Her father had taught her to read a vessel the way a doctor reads a patient, with attention and without judgment, looking for the truth of its condition beneath whatever surface impression it chose to present. The Starlight Queen was tired. She was weathered and neglected, and in some places genuinely dangerous. But her bones were good. The iron framing beneath the rotted timber was pitted but solid. The hull planking, where it was not purely cosmetic, had more integrity than it had any right to after 2 decades of desert extremes. She was not dying. She was sleeping. May climbed to the upper decks. The grand ballroom stopped her cold. The windows were mostly gone. The imported glass had either been taken or broken by the desert's cycles of heat and cold, but the frames remained, and through them the afternoon light fell across the ballroom's interior in long golden shafts that made the remaining crystal of the chandeliers throw small rainbows across the faded walls. The chandeliers themselves, 3 of them hung. At angles, their chains corroded their crystal drops, filmed with dust, but largely intact. The parquet floor was warped, its inlaid pattern almost invisible beneath the grime, but the craftsmanship of the original installation still showed the careful geometry of a room built to make people feel that life at its finest was worth the considerable cost of admission. May stood in the center of that ruined ballroom for a long moment, the afternoon light moving around her, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Possibility. The specific, almost painful sensation of a thing not yet made, waiting to be made. She climbed back down and found the hatch that would take her to the subterranean levels, the portion of the Starlight Queen that had been claimed by the earth. It was a heavy iron door, flush with the deck planking with a simple ring-pull handle. She had expected it to be rusted shut. She grasped the ring and pulled. It opened without resistance. She stood very still. Then she crouched down and looked into the opening. A ladder descended into darkness, and from the darkness, very faintly, came a smell that did not belong to abandonment. Not the dry, papery smell of 2 decades of neglect. Something else. Something current. Coal smoke. Old, low, barely there, but coal smoke. The smell of a small fire regularly kept. May held the ladder with both hands and descended into the earth. The lower level was not what she had expected. She had anticipated the damp, the decay, the particular dark of a buried space. Instead, she found a room that was clean, orderly, inhabited. The engine room of the Starlight Queen occupied a space so large that May's lamp, she had brought a small oil lamp from her bag. A habit of preparedness could not reach its far walls. The twin boilers rose from the floor like the rib cages of sleeping giants, their surfaces cleaned and oiled, with a regularity that had prevented the rust that should by rights have consumed them entirely. The great piston arms, still and silent, had been wiped down, and their joints packed with grease. The brass fittings on the gauge panels had been polished to a shine that caught May's lamplight and threw it back. Someone was taking care of this room. Someone had been taking care of it for a very long time. Between the 2 boilers, in a space that had been cleared and made livable, with the particular ingenuity of someone who has learned to make very little, go very far, there was a living space, a cot, a small iron stove, its pipe running up through a cleverly disguised vent in the deck above, a wooden crate that served as a table holding a tin cup, a book, and a stub of candle, a second crate as a chair, shelves made from planks and rope holding canned provisions, tools, folded cloth, a pair of worn boots. It was Spartan and careful. and entirely human. May stood in the doorway of this hidden room, this space within a space. This life lived at the bottom of a buried ship in the middle of a Nevada desert, and she understood with a certainty that settled into her bones, like the cold of the underground air, that she was not alone. The compass was in her hand. She had taken it out without thinking, the way you reach for something familiar when the world surprises you. The needle turned, settled, pointed its patient way north. She looked at it for a moment, and then she lifted her lamp and looked at the great, clean, sleeping engine room around her, and she understood something else. She was not going to leave. Whatever this was, whoever this was, she was going to meet it. She had bought this ship. She had $5 to her name. She had a father's compass and a dead captain's deed, and a mind full of engineering principles, and 8 years of practiced patience. She had walked in the front door of her own life and found someone already living in the basement. May Calloway set her lamp on the crate table. She sat down on the floor with her back against the warm iron side of the nearest boiler, and she settled in to wait. The needle on the compass did not waver. She held it in her hand, the brass worn smooth and warm now from her grip, and she thought about what her father had always said about engines, that the most important thing before you ever touched a wrench was to understand what the machine was designed to do, to know its purpose before you started changing anything. She was beginning to understand this ship's purpose. She was not yet sure she understood her own, but she was patient. She had always been patient. And the Starlight Queen, for all its abandonment and all its silence, had the feeling of a place that had been waiting too. Not decaying, waiting. The way a compass waits for someone to pick it up. The way a heading waits for someone to decide to follow it. Outside, the Nevada sun was beginning its descent toward the white horizon. In the ballroom, 3 stories above her, the last light of day would be moving through those remaining crystal drops, throwing its small, patient rainbows across the faded walls. In the town of Drywell, half a mile away, people were closing up their shops and lighting their evening lamps, and somewhere among them, someone knew the secret of this ship's basement, knew why the engine room was clean, knew who had been tending these great sleeping boilers with such quiet and anonymous devotion. May turned the compass over in her hand. She looked at the needle. She looked at the dark beyond her lamplight, the vast, clean, carefully maintained dark of this buried room. "Hello," she said to the dark, to the ship, to whatever came next. Her voice did not echo. The room absorbed it the way the desert absorbs everything, without judgment, without return. But she felt in the quality of that silence something she recognized, the particular held-breath stillness of a thing about to change. She was 20 years old. She had $5 in her pocket, a deed to a sunken palace, and her father's compass in her hand. She was sitting at the bottom of a buried steamship in the middle of the Nevada desert, waiting to meet whoever was living in the dark. It was without question the best decision she had made in her entire life. She did not have to wait long. Perhaps 20 minutes passed. She counted them by the slow, meditative rhythm of her own breathing and the faint sound of wind moving through the decks above her. Then she heard footsteps. Not the tentative footsteps of someone who had discovered her presence and was approaching with caution, but the deliberate, unhurried footsteps of someone who had known she was there, from the moment she descended the ladder and had simply been deciding what to do about it. They came from deeper in the engine room, from somewhere beyond the reach of her lamp, from the far darkness where the great paddle wheel shaft disappeared into the earth. Slow even with the particular cadence of a man who had long since stopped hurrying anywhere. He emerged into the lamplight gradually, the way figures emerge in dreams. First a shape, then details, then a whole person. He was old. Not frail, old, not diminished old, but the kind of old that comes from a life lived entirely outdoors and at hard labor, the kind that strips everything unnecessary away and leaves only what is essential. 70 years, perhaps. A face so weathered it had passed through craggy and arrived at something closer to carved deep lines around the eyes and mouth, a jaw that suggested it had set itself against the world early and never fully relaxed. White hair close cropped, hands that were extraordinary wide across the palm, the knuckles thick as walnut shells, the fingers bearing the specific calluses of a man who had worked rope and iron for most of his life. He wore simple clothes worn clean. He carried no lamp. He had clearly been moving through this dark with the confidence of someone who no longer needed light to find his way. He stopped about 8 feet from where May sat on the floor and looked at her with eyes that were gray and extraordinarily calm, the eyes of a man who had decided at some point in the distant past that very few things in the world were worth agitation. He said nothing for a moment. She said nothing. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people taking each other's measure, which is a different thing entirely from the silence of people who have nothing to say. "You bought her," the old man said finally. It was not a question. "This morning," May said. "From Cecil Drummond at the land office. $70. She paused. "I have the deed." The old man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted a minute adjustment, like a compass needle finding a new reading. He lowered himself onto the second crate with the slow care of a man whose joints had opinions about cold floors, and he looked at her steadily. "Jonas Creel," he said. "Able seaman, retired. A beat. 19 years on this ship." May did the arithmetic without moving. "The ship has been grounded since 1868, she said. "That's 21 years. "I came back in 1870, he said. 2 years after. Wasn't ready to come back before that." He said it simply without apology or elaboration, the way people state facts that have long since made their peace with themselves. May looked at the clean engine room around her, at the oiled boilers, the greased pistons, the polished brass. "You've been maintaining it," she said. "All this time, someone had to." He reached into his shirt and drew out a length of cord from which hung a single key. Old iron, heavy its bow, worn smooth. He held it in his palm without offering it. "Captain Cross asked me to stay. Before he died." He looked at the key, then back at her. "Edmund Cross. He was her captain for 10 years. A good man. He died in 1875, working odd jobs in town, living aboard the ship. Before he went, he asked me to stay and wait." "Wait for what?" May said. Jonas Creel looked at her with those gray, untroubled eyes. "For whoever came," he said. He said I'd know when I found them. He closed his hand around the key and tucked it back against his chest. I haven't found them yet. May looked at the key, and then at Jonas Creel, and then at the great sleeping boilers behind him. She thought about what her father had said about engines, that before you touched anything, you had to understand what it was designed to do. She thought about 8 years of keeping books that recorded her as an operating cost. She thought about the compass in her hand and what it meant to know your heading when the river bends. What would it take, she said, to find them? Jonas Creel almost smiled. It was a very small almost. Time, he said, and I don't rush it. He stood slowly, and without another word he walked back into the darkness from which he had come. His footsteps faded. The engine room returned to its patient silence. May sat with her lamp and her compass, and the sound of her own breathing, and she was not discouraged. She had been patient for 8 years in a house that did not want her. She could be patient here in a ship that had been waiting for someone to want it. She turned the compass over in her hand. The needle found north. It always found north. All right, she said to the room to the ship to herself. We'll do this your way. Morning came to the Starlight Queen the way it comes to all desert places, suddenly. And without apology, the darkness giving way in minutes to a light so bright and total that it seemed less like sunrise and more like an announcement. May had slept on the engine room floor with her carpet bag as a pillow, which was not comfortable but was sufficient. And she woke to the sound of Jonas Creel moving around his small living space between the boilers, filling a tin pot from a water barrel, setting it on his small iron stove with the economical movements of long practice. He made coffee without comment. He set a second tin cup on the crate table without comment. May accepted it without comment. They drank in the particular silence of two people who have already said the essential things and are now waiting to see what comes next. The coffee was strong and bitter and very good. After a while, Jonas said, "What are you going to do with her? May had been thinking about this since before she bought the deed. Since, if she was honest, the moment she had seen the ship from the ridge above town. Make her useful, she said. She was built to serve people. She can still do that even here, even like this. Jonas Creel said nothing, but he refilled her cup. So is she. May's first week aboard the Starlight Queen was a systematic campaign against 21 years of neglect, conducted with the methodical intensity of someone who has a great deal to do and no time to waste, feeling overwhelmed by the size of the task. She started at the top and worked down. The upper deck had suffered most from exposure, the planking shrunken and split from decades of temperature extremes, the gaps between boards wide enough to let through wind and dust, and the occasional determined scorpion. May spent the first 2 days on her hands and knees with a caulking iron and a pot of pine tar she had purchased from Drywell's general store, working compound into every seam with the patient thoroughness her father had taught her. Ship's caulking, the method sailors had used for centuries to keep water out. It worked equally well, she discovered, to keep desert in. The broken windows came next. She bought glass panes from the general store. The owner, a taciturn man named Bassett, sold them to her without inquiry and charged her fairly, which she noted and appreciated, and spent 3 days learning by trial and error and one broken pane, the precise technique for setting glass into a weathered frame so it would hold against the desert wind. By the end of the 3rd day, she had 6 windows on the main deck, sealed and clear, and the interior of that section of the ship had taken on a quality it had probably not had in 2 decades, the quality of inside. Water was the problem that could not wait. The ship had no running water, obviously, and the town well was a half-mile walk across the salt flat. May made the trip twice each day with 2 large buckets she found in the ship's galley, carrying them back with the slow, careful gait of someone who understands that every drop has a cost. She learned to be precise with it. Drinking water and cooking water were sacrosanct. Gray water used once was used again for washing floors. Nothing was wasted. It was, she thought, not so different from keeping accounts. Every resource tracked, every outflow justified. In the evenings, she heated whatever she had purchased in the galley, beans mostly, and hardtack with occasional eggs when she could get them on a small camp stove she had assembled from parts salvaged from the ship's original galley equipment. She was not a sophisticated cook. She was a sufficient one, which was what the situation required. Jonas Creel came and went without schedule, appearing at the edge of her lamplight, sometimes with a tool she needed, or a piece of information she had been working toward, and then disappearing again into the lower levels, with the self-containment of a man who had made his own company sufficient long ago. He never offered help. But occasionally, when May was wrestling with a problem that had a specific solution, he happened to know he would state that solution in the flat, declarative tone of someone reading from a manual and then leave her to apply it. She asked him one evening about Captain Cross, about the man who had asked him to stay. Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then, "He was the kind of man who felt things very deeply and said very little about it. You can usually tell those men by what they build and what they keep." He turned his tin cup in his hands. "He kept that ship clean for 7 years after the river went, just the 2 of us. Wouldn't let her go to ruin. Said she deserved better than that." A pause. He was right. "What happened to his family?" May said. "Wife and daughter," Jonas said. "Fever. The winter of 1868, same year the river went. Daughter was 6 years old." He said it without drama, which made it hit harder than drama would have. After that, he had nothing to go anywhere for, so he stayed. And then he died, and I stayed. On account of the promise. May thought about that, about staying somewhere because a promise required it, even long past the point where anyone would have blamed you for leaving. "That's a long time to keep a promise," she said. "A promise doesn't get shorter." Jonas said, "Just because the person you made it to is gone." It was on the 8th day that the town began to come to her. It started with August Dre. August was 65 years old and had been Drywell's carpenter since before the river vanished, which meant he had watched the town decline from something to almost nothing with the patience of a man who simply could not imagine living anywhere else. He was built like the timber he worked. solid, seasoned with no unnecessary parts. He showed up at the base of the gangplank on a Tuesday morning with his hands in the bib of his overalls and a look on his face that was attempting not entirely successfully to appear casual. He watched May working on the railing for a long time. She was attempting to sister a cracked support post with a new length of hardwood, using a method that was technically correct, but structurally not quite right, because she had not yet learned the proper joint for this kind of repair. "That's going to pull loose," August Dre said, finally nodding at her work. May stopped. She looked at the joint, she looked at him. "What would you use?" "Mortise and tenon," he said, "if you want it to last." "I don't know that joint," May said. August Dre looked at her for a moment with the evaluating squint of a craftsman, deciding whether a student is worth teaching. Then he walked up the gangplank, took off his overalls jacket, and spent the next 2 hours showing her. He showed her how to cut the mortise, how to size the tenon, how to fit them together with the particular friction that meant the joint would tighten with load rather than loosen. He showed her twice, had her do it herself, corrected 2 details, and then stood back while she cut her own. It was better than the one he had demonstrated. August Dre said, in the tone of someone who has had a suspicion confirmed. He picked up his jacket. He came back the next morning with a piece of oak and did it again on a different part of the railing without being asked. He never offered money. He never asked for payment. He simply came, and he worked, and he left, and he came back. May came to understand that this was how August Dre expressed approval, not with words which he used sparingly, but with the repeated gift of his presence and his knowledge. Della Finch came 3 days after August Dre. She was the wife of the town's baker, a round-faced woman of about 45, with quick, kind eyes, and the kind of warmth that fills a room before she does. She arrived at the gangplank on a Friday afternoon, carrying a basket covered with a cloth napkin, and she announced her intention directly without preamble. "I see your lamp burning past midnight every night," she said. "A body cannot run on hard work alone. My mother always said that, and she was right about most things." She held out the basket. Inside a loaf of bread, still warm from the oven, a crock of butter sealed with wax, and a thick slab of spiced apple cake wrapped in paper. May stood on the deck, holding the basket, and felt something she had not expected to feel, a specific, almost painful sensation in the chest that she identified after a moment as being seen. Simply, practically, without ceremony, seen. "Thank you," May said. Della Finch waved a hand as though it were nothing, though they both knew it was something. "I'll come Tuesdays and Fridays," she said in the tone of someone making an administrative decision. "You just keep the lamp burning so I know you're up." She came Tuesdays and Fridays. She always stayed exactly long enough to deposit her basket and exchange a few words, and never long enough to become an obligation. May came to understand that Della Finch was a woman who understood with great precision the difference between help that lifts and help that weighs, and she gave only the former. Stellan Hale was the third. He was the town's blacksmith, 30 years old, with arms that seemed to belong to a considerably larger person, and a demeanor of such concentrated seriousness that it could be mistaken at first for unfriendliness. He was not unfriendly. He was simply precise. He used words the way a careful craftsman uses material, no more than the job requires, and none of it wasted. May went to his forge on a Wednesday morning with one of her father's engineering schematics, the drawing of a specific hinge assembly, heavy-duty, the kind that could carry the weight of the Starlight Queen's massive cargo door, which she needed to fabricate from scratch. She spread the drawing on his workbench without preamble and explained what she needed. Stellan Hale looked at the drawing for a long time, his eyes moving over it with the methodical attention of a professional reading a document in his own language. "Your father drew this," he said. "Yes," May said. He looked at her. "He was an engineer." "Riverboat. Yes." Stellan Hale nodded once the way people nod when information confirms something they had already half decided. "I can make this," he said. "But you should help. You know what it needs to do. That matters more than you might think." For 2 days, May worked beside him at the forge, learning the rhythm of the hammer and the precise moment when iron shifts from workable to brittle, learning the smell of steel at the right temperature, and the sound it makes when it hits the water for quenching a violent, decisive hiss that she found unexpectedly satisfying. Stellan charged her for the iron and nothing else. He taught her 3 things about metalwork that she had not known and that her father's schematics had not covered, and he taught them without condescension, in the same flat, precise way he approached everything, as though the transmission of useful knowledge were simply a matter of accuracy. What was forming around May in these quiet weeks of work and small exchanges was not friendship in the conventional sense. It was something older and in some ways more durable. It was the community of people who recognize in each other a fundamental seriousness about work and who offer their knowledge and their presence as a form of respect. They saw May climb that gangplank every morning and descend it every night. They saw her lamp burning past midnight. They saw the windows going in and the railing being repaired and the deck getting cleaner, and they saw a person who was not performing effort, but simply making it day after day, without complaint and without audience. They did not discuss it with each other, or if they did, May never heard. They simply appeared each in their own way with whatever they had to offer. And Drywell, which had long since grown accustomed to watching things decline, found itself watching something different. It watched something being built. "4 weeks into her occupancy of the Starlight Queen on a cool October evening, when the desert sky had gone the color of a bruise, and the first real chill of autumn was moving through the gaps in the deck, planking Jonas Creel came to find May. She was in the engine room, which had become her secondary study. She had been spending her evenings there with her father's schematics and a lamp going over the boiler configurations and comparing them to the actual machinery in front of her matching diagram to reality, learning what remained intact and what would need to be replaced if the boilers were ever to be functional again. She had no plan to run the ship, but she wanted to understand it. She always wanted to understand the thing completely, even when understanding it had no immediate practical application. Jonas Creel stood in the engine room doorway and watched her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Come with me." He led her through the engine room, past the boilers, past his own small living space, into the far reaches of the underground. Level, where May had not yet been a passage that ran beneath the full length of the buried hull, low-ceilinged and close-lit by the single lamp Jonas carried. At the far end of the passage, a short ladder led up to a hatch. May followed him up. The hatch opened onto the interior of the pilot house, the glassed-in command station at the forward end of the upper deck, where the helmsman had once stood with the great wooden wheel and the whole river laid out ahead. Beyond the pilot house, a door led to the captain's walk, an exterior platform on the forward face of the vessel open to the sky, commanding the widest possible view of the river that no longer existed and the desert that had replaced it. They stood on the captain's walk in the last of the evening light. Below them, Drywell's scattered buildings threw their lamp light into the gathering dark. The salt flat was silver in the dusk. The air was cold and clean and tasted of nothing. "You've been here 5 weeks, Jonas Creel said. 4 weeks and 3 days, May said. I've been watching you. He said it without apology because it was not a thing to apologize for. He had been honest about it from the beginning in his way. The way you work, the way you talk to people, the way you don't take more than you need and don't waste what you have. He turned and looked at her directly with those gray, considering eyes. Captain Cross didn't say I'd recognize the right person by how they handled wood or iron. He said I'd recognize them by how they handled people and hard things. May said nothing. She had learned that Jonas Creel, when he was heading towards something, got there in his own time. August Dre told me about the joint you cut, Jonas said. He said you did it right on the second try and didn't need to be told why, just how. He paused. Della Finch said you thanked her like you meant it. Not polite thanks, real thanks. Like you'd been a long time without anyone noticing whether you were fed. Another pause. Stellan Hale said you asked better questions than most men he'd taught. The wind moved across the captain's walk. Below them, a light came on in the general store window. Jonas Creel reached into his shirt and drew out the key on its cord. He held it in his palm, the old iron dark against his wide, weathered hand. The key to the captain's cabin, locked for 21 years. Captain Cross said to give it to whoever fixes what everyone else called broken, Jonas said. He looked at the key and then at May, and something in his face shifted, something behind the weathered calm, something that might have been in another man, a form of relief. He didn't mean the ship. He held out the key. May looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. It was heavier than she expected, the iron worn smooth at the bow, where fingers had handled it. She closed her hand around it and felt its weight in her palm beside the compass, one old piece of metal beside another. "Thank you," she said. Jonas Creel nodded. He looked out over the desert for a moment. Then he went back through the pilot house door and down into the ship, and May stood alone. On the captain's walk, with the key in one hand and the compass in the other, and the dark coming on across the basin, and Drywell's scattered lights below her like a small, imperfect constellation. She did not go to the captain's cabin that night. She was not ready. Some things should not be rushed, and she understood with the instinct of someone who had been patient for a very long time that the captain's cabin required its own form of preparation, not physical preparation, but the interior kind. The kind that comes from knowing you are ready to receive what a locked room has been holding. She spent the night in her own small space, the steward's cabin she had claimed on the main deck. In her first days, its door rehung, its window freshly glazed, its floor scrubbed clean. She spread her father's schematics on the floor and went over them one more time. Not looking for information, but for company. The familiar lines of his hand, a form of conversation that distance and death could not entirely end. She slept well. In the morning, she took the key and went to the captain's cabin. The cabin door was at the forward end of the upper deck, solid oak, its brass fittings tarnished to a deep brown. The keyhole was dark, the lock mechanism stiff with 2 decades of disuse. May did not simply insert the key and turn it. Her father had taught her better than that. She took her small oil can from her kit and worked a few drops of oil into the keyhole. Waited, worked in a few more, and then carefully, with slow and steady pressure, rather than force, she inserted the key and began to turn it. The lock resisted. She did not force it. She applied pressure, released, applied again, feeling for the give. Within the mechanism, the way you listen for the sound a bearing makes when it is close to alignment. The tumblers shifted. A pin caught. She adjusted the angle by a fraction. Another pin. The resistance changed in quality from obstruction to reluctance, which is different and requires a different kind of patience. The lock turned. The door swung inward on its heavy hinges, with a sound that was not quite a creak and not quite a sigh, but something between the two. The sound of a thing that has been closed for a very long time, opening to the air for the first time in memory. The cabin air that came out was stale and dry and carried the scent of old paper and sun-baked timber and something else fainter that might have been pipe tobacco from 20 years ago, might have been machine oil, might have been simply the particular smell of a man's long-inhabited space that lingers even after the man is gone. May stepped inside. The captain's cabin was not large. It was the right size, purposeful, functional, designed for a man who needed to work and sleep and think in the same room, who had no interest in luxury for its own sake, but required a space that was adequate to serious living. A desk of solid oak against the far wall, its surface clear except for a heavy leather-bound log book lying open and a brass oil lamp beside it with its glass chimney intact. A narrow cot to the left, its blanket folded with a precision that had survived 21 years of abandonment, with its geometry entirely intact. To the right, a large iron-banded sea chest. May moved to the desk first. She brushed the dust from the log book's open pages with the careful hand of someone handling something important. The ink was faded, but entirely legible, written in a strong, clear hand that had the particular quality of someone accustomed to writing at sea. Deliberate, economical, making every word count because at sea there was always something more urgent than writing. She read the final entries. May of 1868, the river dropping. June 1st, the last day. Tied her up at the dry well landing for the last time. The company has dissolved. The passengers are gone. I am all that remains. The river is gone, God help us. Signed Captain Edmund Cross. May stood very still for a moment. Then she began to clean the cabin, not with haste, not with the efficient energy of her first weeks, but with a quieter attention, the kind you bring to something that deserves it. She wiped the desk, the lamp, the surface of the sea chest. She straightened the log book. She looked at the room and understood what it had been, what it had cost the man who had inhabited it, what it meant that it had been kept locked and waiting all this time. It was when she was wiping down the front panel of the desk, a low section beneath the main drawer, running the full width of the piece, that she noticed it. A difference in the grain of the wood, subtle. The kind of thing you would miss if you were looking at the desk rather than touching it, if you were seeing rather than feeling. She ran her fingers along the panel's edge. No seam, no handle. She measured the depth of the drawers against the depth of the desk, and found what she had found in Harlan's ledgers 100 times a discrepancy. A space that was not accounted for. She tapped the panel. Left side, dull, solid. Moving right, still solid. Near the right edge, hollow. She pressed. She felt a click, faint mechanical, the release of a hidden catch. A section of the panel swung inward on a hinge, so well fitted it had been invisible. Inside the dark cavity, an oilcloth bundle tied with twine, and beneath it a neat stack of banknotes held together with a leather strap. May did not move for a long moment. Then she lifted the money and counted it. Federal notes and gold certificates. Their edges slightly foxed with age, but otherwise intact. She counted it twice. Both times she arrived at the same number. $3,000. She set the money down carefully and lifted the oilcloth bundle, untied the twine, unrolled it on the desk with steady hands, though her heart was not steady at all. Inside a letter, the paper yellowed but perfectly preserved by the oilcloth, and the sealed dark of the hidden compartment, and beneath the letter, a small object that stopped her completely. A bird, carved from a single piece of driftwood, perhaps 4 inches long. A bird with its wings half spread, caught in the moment between rest and flight, between the known and the unknown. The carving was simple, but not crude, the kind of work made by a person with skill and patience, and something specific to express that words were not adequate for. The kind of work made for a child small enough for a child's hand, shaped with a child's imagination of what freedom looks like when it takes a form you can hold. May held it in her palm for a long time. Then she picked up the letter. The handwriting matched the logbook, the same deliberate, economical hand. At the top of the page, simply, "To whoever finds this." She sat in Captain Edmund Cross's chair in Captain Edmund Cross's cabin, with $3,000 on the desk and a carved wooden bird in one hand, and she began to read. The letter was not long. He was not a man, she could tell, who used more words than a thing required. He had been her captain for 10 years, he wrote. He had loved her the way men love the things that carry them through the world, not with sentiment, but with the deep, practical attachment of someone who understands bone deep that the thing is part of what keeps them alive and moving and themselves. When the river went and the company dissolved, the ship had come to him as his final severance. He had intended to sell her for scrap and take his family west. There had been no buyers. And then the fever had come. His wife, Sarah, his daughter, Lily, 6 years old, within a week of each other that winter of 1868. After that, he wrote, there was nothing to go west for. He had stayed. He had worked. He had lived aboard the ship and kept her as best he could and saved every dollar he earned because saving was the only form of order he had left, and he had needed order very badly for several years. He had asked Jonas Creel, an old crewman, who had come back to stay and wait and to give the key to whoever came who deserved it. The money he wrote was everything he had. Not a fortune, a stake. Enough to start something. He had no family left to leave it to, and so he left it to the principle of the thing, to the person with enough patience and vision to find value in what everyone else had given up as worthless. Use it well, he wrote. Make this place matter again, not for me, but for everyone who stayed when they had every reason to leave. All I ask is that you remember that a man named Edmund Cross loved his family and loved this ship. The bird belonged to Lily. I could not leave it behind. The letter was signed Captain E. Cross. May folded the letter carefully along its original creases and set it in its oilcloth. She placed it beside the money. She held the wooden bird in both hands and looked at it, this small, simple, devastating object. This thing made by a father for a daughter who had not lived to grow up this artifact of a love that had survived 21 years in the dark of a hidden drawer because there had been nowhere adequate to put it. She understood then why Jonas Creel had waited 19 years, why he had stayed through Nevada winters and Nevada summers, and the slow, grinding weight of isolation and time, maintaining his vigil in the engine room of a buried ship in the middle of a desert. He had been keeping faith with a man who had kept faith with his grief by keeping faith with his ship. There was a chain of it, an unbroken line of fidelity running from Edmund Cross through Jonas Creel. To this moment, this cabin, this carved bird in the hands of a 20-year-old woman who had arrived with nothing and been given everything. The compass was in her pocket. She had not taken it out since entering the cabin, but she could feel its weight against her leg, the small, constant, faithful pull of its needle toward north. She looked around the captain's cabin, the desk, the cot, the log book, the lamp. She looked at the $3,000, which was more money than she had ever seen in one place, and which was, she understood clearly, not a windfall, but a trust. A responsibility passed forward across 2 decades of darkness, a belief that somewhere, sometime, the right person would come and know what to do with it. She was 20 years old. She had a deed to a sunken ship, a dead captain's letter, and a father's compass. She had a carpenter who came without being asked, and a baker's wife who came on Tuesdays and Fridays, and a blacksmith who had charged her only for the iron. She had a ship with good bones, and a town that had forgotten it was worth anything. She had $3,000 and a purpose. May Calloway set the carved wooden bird on the corner of the desk, its wings half spread in their permanent gesture of almost flight, and she reached into her pocket and set the brass compass beside it, her father's instrument beside Captain Cross's keepsake, one guide to direction and one guide to home. She looked at them for a long moment side by side on the old oak desk in the late morning light of the Nevada desert. Then she pulled a piece of paper from the desk drawer, picked up the captain's pen, and she began to plan. The plan took 2 days to write, not because May was uncertain about what she wanted to do, She had known that in some fundamental way, from the moment she had stood in the ruined ballroom and felt the particular ache of possibility. She took 2 days because she was her father's daughter, which meant she did not begin work on a machine until she understood its every component, and she was also, whether she liked to admit it or not, her uncle's niece, which meant she did not commit resources until the numbers were sound. She sat at Captain Cross's desk with paper and pencil, and she worked it through. The Starlight Queen would become 2 things simultaneously because the basin needed 2 things, and she happened to have them. The upper 3 decks, the promenade level, the saloon level, the ballroom level would become the Starlight Inn. Clean rooms, simple food, a common area where travelers could rest in something better than the rough accommodations Drywell currently offered, which amounted to 2 grimy rooms. Above the saloon that smelled of old tobacco and older decisions. The basin was not empty of traffic. Surveyors, geologists, prospectors, circuit judges, families, moving west. They all passed through Drywell, and they all needed somewhere to sleep that was not the open desert. The lower level, the buried section, the engine room, the long underground space where Jonas Creel had lived and kept his faith would become the workshop, a proper one, with benches and tools and the small forge she and Stellan Hale would build together, and the great dormant machinery of the original engine room cleaned and displayed as what it actually was, the most extraordinary collection of 19th century steam engineering outside of a museum, and a daily reminder of what human ingenuity looked like when it was given sufficient ambition and sufficient iron. She named it on paper before she named it anywhere else. The Starlight Inn and Workshop. She wrote it at the top of the page in her clearest hand and looked at it for a while, and it was right. It had the sound of something real. The money she allocated with the precision of someone who had kept accounts for 8 years and understood viscerally the difference between investment and expenditure. Lumber from the town mill, glass for the remaining windows, paint white for the hull, navy for the trim gold for the name on the bow, new mattresses for the cabin rooms, a proper cook stove for the galley, hardware of every kind. She budgeted for labor, though most of the labor she already knew would come, without invoice, in the form of August Dre's morning visits, and Stellan Hale's professional instruction, and a dozen smaller contributions from a town that had slowly stopped laughing and started watching with something that looked, if you squinted, like hope. She kept $200 in reserve. Her father had taught her that a machine always needed a contingency. The unexpected repair, the failed component, the thing you could not have anticipated until it failed. Life, she had found, worked the same way. When the plan was finished, she read it through, twice, made 3 small corrections, and went to find Jonas Creel. She found him where she usually found him, in the engine room in the early morning, with his coffee and his silence and his long view of things. She spread the plan on the crate table between them. He read it without speaking, his eyes moving across the pages with the same steady attention he brought to everything. When he finished, he turned back to the first page and read it again. May waited. She had learned that Jonas Creel's second reading was not uncertainty, it was respect for the thing being considered. He set the pages down. He looked at her. The engine room, he said. "You want to keep the machinery. It belongs here," May said. "It's part of what this place is. People should see it, understand what it was." She paused. "And the workshop needs the space and the infrastructure. The ventilation is already there. The load-bearing floor is already there. The forge can go in the northeast corner against the original firewall." Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Captain Cross would have liked that, keeping her engines as the center of the thing." He picked up his coffee. "He always said the heart of a ship was its engine room. Not the bridge, not the saloon. The engine room." "He was right," May said. Jonas Creel looked at the plan one more time. Then he set his cup down and stood up with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints require acknowledgement. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I know this ship better than anyone alive. Where the sound timber is, where it isn't, where the original systems can be salvaged, and where they can't." He met her eyes. "I've had 19 years to learn her. Might as well be useful." It was the longest consecutive speech she had heard him make. She recognized it for what it was. "I'd be glad of it," she said. "So boy." What followed was the most concentrated and purposeful period of work May Calloway had ever known, which was saying something given that she had spent 8 years as the invisible engine of a merchant's accounts. The difference was this: for the first time in her life, the work was hers. Every nail she drove, every pane of glass she set, every seam she caulked and bored. She replaced and surfaced, she sanded and painted. It was hers. The results accumulated in her name and nowhere else. The Starlight Queen was becoming something, and the thing it was becoming was directly proportional to her effort and her vision and her willingness to be wrong twice before she was right once. No one else was keeping the ledger. No one else was recording the hours. It was, she thought on a November evening, while painting the second coat of white on the hull's upper section, the first time she had ever worked without wondering what someone else was going to do with the product of her labor. The community that had formed around her deepened and widened as the weeks passed. August Dre became indispensable. He had forgotten more about timber joinery than most carpenters ever learned, and he transmitted this knowledge with the generosity of a man who has realized late in life that knowledge kept is knowledge lost. He showed May how to sister a failing joist, how to read the grain of old wood for hidden rot, how to make salvaged timber behave like new. If you understood its history and worked with, rather than against, what the years had done to it. He came every morning, worked until noon, went home for dinner, and came back for 2 hours in the afternoon. He asked for nothing. May began leaving a plate of food on the crate outside the gangplank at lunchtime, and he began eating it, and neither of them commented on the arrangement. Della Finch's Tuesday and Friday visits quietly became the foundation of what would be the inn's kitchen. Della did not simply bring food, she brought knowledge. How to cook for travelers who were tired and hungry and needed sustaining rather than impressing. How to make a barrel of flour and a side of salt pork last 3 weeks without serving the same meal twice. How to keep a fire in a ship's galley stove at the right temperature for bread when the desert wind was pulling the heat sideways out of the flue. May was a competent cook, she had established that. Della Finch was making her a good one. Stellan Hale came every Saturday with his own tools and worked on the forge installation in the engine room's northeast corner, as May had planned, building it with the same wordless precision he brought to everything. The forge took 3 weeks to complete, and was, when finished, a beautiful thing, compact, efficient, with a bellows system, salvaged from the ship's original fire suppression equipment, and a flue that Jonas Creel had identified running through the hull's aft wall, designed for exactly this purpose by an engineer who had understood 100 years ago that a working vessel would always need a forge. The other members of Drywell drifted in and out. Bassett from the general store came one afternoon with a load of hardware. He said he'd over-ordered, though May doubted it and accepted her payment with a brevity that suggested the gesture mattered more than the money. Cecil Drummond, who had sold her the deed with such cheerful incredulity, came by on a December morning, with his eye shade pushed up on his forehead, and stood at the base of the gangplank, looking up at the freshly painted hull, with an expression he probably would not have wanted anyone to see. He saw May watching from the upper deck. "Well," he called up to her, "I'll be damned." "Most likely," May called back pleasantly, and he laughed for a long time. Chink. The first room was ready in November, the second and third in December. By January of 1894, months after May had descended from a stagecoach with $5 and a brass compass, all 4 guest cabins on the main deck were complete. The grand saloon, which had housed the ghosts of velvet chairs and crystal chandeliers for 21 years, had been transformed into a common room of considerable character. Its original parquet floor restored to a warm amber by August Dre's patient. Sanding its remaining chandelier, the most intact of the 3, its crystals cleaned and reset by May herself over 3 evenings of meticulous work, rehung at a height that was both safe and beautiful. The galley kitchen was fully operational, its new cook stove burning steadily, its shelves stocked. The ballroom on the upper deck, its damaged windows replaced, and its floor repaired though not yet restored, served as an overflow common area, and on clear days a place of extraordinary light. Downstairs the workshop was open and equipped. The forge was ready. The benches were solid. The great engine room machinery, the twin boilers, the piston arms, the paddle wheel shaft had been cleaned and oiled to a standard that Jonas Creel supervised, with exacting attention, and in the lamplight they were magnificent. These enormous sleeping machines, filling the underground room with a presence that was somehow both monumental and intimate, the way truly great engineering always is. The Starlight Inn and Workshop opened on a Monday morning in January of 1890, which was also the first genuinely cold day of a Nevada winter. The desert white, not with snow, but with a thick alkaline frost that covered the salt flat in crystalline silence. May stood at the top of the gangplank in the early morning and looked at the sign August Dre had made for her and mounted to the hull's main deck railing the previous afternoon. The Starlight Inn and Workshop. M. Calloway, proprietor. The letters were clean and even cut from good hardwood and painted in the same navy blue as the hull trim. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went inside and lit the cook stove and started the coffee, because there was work to do and a life to run, And standing on the deck, admiring your own sign, was not how either of those things got done. The first guest arrived that afternoon. He was a geologist from the State Survey, a precise, spectacled man of about 40 named Hargreave, who had been conducting basin surveys for 3 months and had been sleeping in a tent and was visibly done with it. He came up the gangplank with a pack on his back and the specific expression of a man who has been told something exists but does not entirely believe it until he sees it. He saw it. He stood in the doorway of the common room and looked at the restored chandelier, throwing its light across the amber floor and the clean windows and the small fire burning in the hearth that August Dre had built into the room's forward wall. "Good Lord," Hargreave said. "Room is $2 a night," May said from behind the counter she had built from the ship's original bar fixture. "Meals included. There's a workshop downstairs if you need equipment repairs or fabrication." Hargreave looked around the room. He looked at the sign above the counter. He looked at May. "How long has this been here?" he said. "About 4 months," May said. "In its current form." He stayed for a month. He paid in gold. He told every surveyor, geologist, and territorial agent he encountered about the Starlight Inn, and he described it in terms that made people make the detour to Drywell specifically to see if the description was accurate. It was. They came after that in a steady and growing stream. A circuit judge who needed 3 days of rest and a quiet room to write his decisions. 2 fur trappers whose wagon needed an axle repair that May completed in an afternoon, using the skills Stellan Hale had given her and the tools in her father's kit. A family of 5 heading to California, who stopped for 2 nights and whose children May let come down to the engine room to see the machinery watching their faces in the lamplight go through the same sequence of expressions she imagined her own face had made: shock, then disbelief, then the particular wonder of suddenly understanding that the world contained things larger and stranger and more magnificent than you had known. A widow traveling alone who stayed a week and helped May in the kitchen every morning without being asked, and spoke little and ate well and left a note on her pillow that said only, "Thank you for making somewhere safe." May kept the note in her desk drawer beside the captain's log book. She settled into the rhythms of her new life with the particular satisfaction of someone who has, after a long search, found the work they were made for. She rose before the sun. Always the desert darkness still complete when she went down to the galley to start the cook stove. The smell of coffee was the signal that the day had begun, and it reached into the common room and the guest cabins and out across the gangplank to the salt flat, where the early morning frost was just beginning to lift. August Dre came for coffee at sunrise every morning, without exception lowering himself into the same chair at the same table, by the forward window, watching the light change across the basin in the same meditative silence. They did not always talk. When they did, it was about wood usually, or about the town, or about the particular quality of the Nevada light at different hours of the day, which August had been studying for 40 years and still found interesting. Jonas Creel ran the workshop with the authority and composure of a man who has been waiting his entire life for a job that exactly matched his particular combination of skills and temperament. He knew every tool. He knew every system in the ship. He knew from 19 years of living in it where every creak and shift in the vessel's structure came from, and he could diagnose a problem in the workshop's machinery with the economy of a man who has simply heard everything before. He charged fair prices and did not overestimate jobs, and word traveled quickly among the practical people of the basin that Jonas Creel at the Starlight Workshop would tell you what the job actually cost and then do it correctly the first time. Della Finch supplied the kitchen with bread and pastries twice a week and accepted in return a standing room arrangement for her visiting sister that saved the family more than the baking cost, and which Della regarded as entirely beside the point. Stellan Hale used the workshop forge for his larger projects, the jobs too big for his own smithy, and in exchange kept the workshop's tools sharp and in calibration, which was a contribution worth considerably more than its apparent simplicity. The town of Drywell had not been transformed overnight. Towns do not transform overnight, not really, not in ways that last. What happened was slower and more durable than transformation. What happened was that the town found in the Starlight Queen a center. Not a government center, not a religious center, but a practical and human one. A place where people worked and ate and rested and brought their broken things and left with them. Repaired a place with a lamp always burning, and a coffee pot always ready, and a proprietor who knew every regular customer's preferences and maintained them without being asked. Children from the town came on Saturday mornings to see the engine room. May had begun telling them about the machinery, not lecturing, not instructing, but talking. The way her father had talked to her, as though understanding how a thing worked was simply interesting. As though the children's curiosity was the most natural response in the world and deserved a natural answer. They listened with the wide-eyed attention children give to things that are genuinely, verifiably astonishing, and May saw in their faces something she recognized from her own childhood, the particular light that goes on behind a person's eyes when they begin to understand that the world has been built by human hands and can therefore be built differently. It was, she thought, the best part of the work. Better even than the full register, better than the repaired axle and the settled judge and the widow who found somewhere safe. Those were satisfying. This was something more than satisfying. This was the thing her father had tried to give her and had not had long enough to finish giving, being passed forward to people she had not known 6 months ago. In a desert town she had never heard of, aboard a ship that had no business existing where it was. The river finds its course, she thought, even when it has to go underground for a while. It was a Thursday morning in February when Harlan Briggs came to Drywell. May was in the workshop when Jonas came to find her. His face carried its usual economy of expression, but there was something in his eyes, a watchfulness, a specific quality of alertness, the kind that comes when a person is uncertain how information will land. "Man in the common room," Jonas said. "Asking about the proprietor." He paused. "Says his name is Briggs." May set down the fitting she had been working on. She wiped her hands on her work cloth. She felt for a moment the old familiar compression in her chest, the reflex of 8 years, in a house where her presence was a liability. She breathed through it the way she had learned to breathe through the difficulty of a seized mechanism, steadily without force, waiting for the thing to release in its own time. "Thank you, Jonas," she said. She went up to the common room. Harlan Briggs was standing by the forward window looking out at the salt flat and the town below, his hat in his hands. He was wearing his good coat, the one he wore when he meant to make an impression. He had aged, she thought, or perhaps she was simply seeing him for the first time, without the particular distortion that comes from being subject to a person's authority. He looked smaller than she remembered, not diminished exactly, just human-sized. He turned when he heard her step. The recognition crossed his face in stages the way it does when you see someone in a context so far removed from your mental image of them that the brain takes a moment to reconcile the data. He saw a young woman in work clothes with her sleeves rolled up and machine oil on her forearm, and the particular upright composure of someone who is entirely at home in the space she occupies. And then he saw who it was. "May," he said. The word came out differently than she had ever heard him say her name. Not the flat administrative tone of a man addressing a household dependent. Something else. Something that might in another man have been the beginning of something like awe. "Mr. Briggs," May said. He looked around the common room, at the restored chandelier, at the amber floor and the clean windows and the small fire, at the counter with its register and its sign. He looked at the other guests. Hargreave was in his usual chair with his survey notes, and a pair of teamsters were eating breakfast by the far window, and he looked at the way they occupied the space with the easy comfort of people who are somewhere they expect to be welcome. He turned back to May. "I heard there was something unusual here," he said. "A steamship." He looked at the ceiling at the hull's interior structure, visible above the saloon's refitted beams. "I came to see about—" He stopped. The business language he had been reaching for did not come. He tried again. "I thought perhaps there might be an investment opportunity." "There is not," May said, not unkindly, simply. He absorbed this. He looked out the window again. The morning light was coming across the salt flat at a low angle, catching the frost crystals. Still lingering in the shadows of the hull's lower section, making the white desert briefly, improbably beautiful. "You built this," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I did," May said. "With what?" He said it without the ledger voice, without the accounting tone. He said it the way a person says something, when they genuinely do not understand and genuinely want to. May moved to the counter. She opened the register she kept there, not the guest register, but the business accounts. The book she had started on the day she opened, maintained with the same precision she had brought to 8 years of her uncle's books. Every transaction recorded, every outflow justified, every return accounted for. She turned it to the first page. At the top of the first page, in her clearest hand in the column where her uncle's ledger had once listed her under operating costs, she had written one entry. Under the heading, Owner, her name, May Calloway. She turned the book to face him on the counter. He read it. He read the accounts. The careful record of how $3,000 had been allocated, and what it had returned, the costs and the revenues. And the reserves, the story of the Starlight Inn and workshop, told in the language he had always spoken, the language of figures, which did not lie and did not soften and did not require explanation. The first month's profit, $312. The second, $407. The reserve still intact, untouched. Harlan Briggs looked at the ledger for a long time. May did not fill the silence. She had spent 8 years filling silences for this man, making smooth what was uncomfortable, making efficient what was difficult, and she did not owe him that service any longer. When he finally looked up, something had shifted in his face. It was not guilt exactly, and it was not remorse, and she did not need it to be either of those things. It was simpler. It was the expression of a man who has been shown an accounting error. He cannot dispute, not in the numbers, but in the assumptions that underlay them. He had calculated her value once, 8 years ago, and written it in a ledger as an operating cost to be managed. The numbers in front of him now did not agree with that calculation. "I see," he said, quietly, as though seeing were new. "Yes," May said. "I believe you do." He put his hat on. He looked around. The common room one more time. At the chandelier, at the guests, at the name on the sign above the counter. Then he looked at her, and in his face she saw something she had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with, a species of pride. Belated, unearned, without any right to the thing it was feeling. But there, nonetheless. She let him have it. It cost her nothing, and whatever small comfort it gave him as he walked down the gangplank and back across the salt flat toward the road that would take him home to Denton, Ohio, it was more than she had ever been given freely in his house. She watched him go from the forward window, and then she turned back to the common room, to Hargreaves' survey notes, and the teamster's breakfast, and the fire in the hearth, and the amber light of the restored parquet floor, and she felt something she recognized after a moment as the particular lightness that comes when you set down a weight you have been carrying so long. You forgot you were carrying it. She went back to the workshop. There was a fitting to finish. The evening came the way evenings came to the desert, quickly, completely. The last light leaving the basin with a swiftness that always caught her slightly off guard, no matter how many times she had watched it. The salt flat turned from white to gray to silver to dark in the space of 20 minutes, and the stars came out in their Nevada extravagance. More stars than the eastern sky had ever shown her, more stars than seemed strictly necessary, as though the desert, having stripped everything else to its essentials, had decided to be extravagant about at least one thing. May climbed to the captain's walk. She came here most evenings when the guests were settled, and the kitchen was clean, and Jonas was in the workshop doing his final check of the tools, and August Dre had gone home for the night. She came to stand in the cold air with the basin spread below her, and the town's scattered lights throwing their small warmth into the enormous dark, and to think or not to think as the night required. Below her, the Starlight Inn and workshop glowed. The common room windows threw their warm light onto the gangplank and the hard ground at the ship's base. From the galley, a thin curl of smoke rose from the cook stove flue, where May had banked the fire for the night. In the workshop below, she could see Jonas's lamp still moving. He would be another hour, she knew. He kept his own hours, and always had. The town of Drywell was quiet, but alive. Lights in the house windows. The faint sound of a piano from the saloon half a mile away, barely reaching her on the cold air. The smell of other people's fires. The small, particular, unmistakable smell of a community. At rest, not abandoned, not emptied, but simply done with the day's work and gathering itself for the next one. She had been here 5 months. 5 months since she had stepped off a stagecoach with $5 and a deed to an impossible object, and the specific stubbornness of someone who has run out of places to be talked out of things. She thought about her father, about the way he had taught her to read a machine, to understand it before touching it, to find the purpose beneath the surface condition, and work with that purpose rather than against it. She thought about the Starlight Queen, as he would have seen her the extraordinary, improbable achievement of her engineering, the ambition of her original design, the way her bones had held through 21 years of neglect, because good construction is the kind of thing that persists even when everything else fails. She thought about Captain Edmund Cross, who had loved his ship and lost his river, and buried his daughter in the desert and kept faith with a promise to an impossible future, who had saved every dollar and written one letter and asked one old sailor to wait because he believed against all evidence, against all reasonable expectation, that someone would come who would understand what the thing was worth. She thought about Jonas Creel, who had kept 19 years of vigil in an engine room because a good man had asked him to, because a promise did not get shorter just because the person you made it to was gone. She thought about August Dre, who had come up a gangplank on a Tuesday morning because he saw someone working correctly and could not walk away from that. About Della Finch, who had seen a lamp burning past midnight and decided that was reason enough. About Stellan Hale, who had charged her only for the iron. She thought about a carved wooden bird, with its wings half spread, sitting on a corner of an old oak desk in a cabin that had been locked for 21 years, waiting for someone to find it and understand what it meant. She reached into her pocket and took out the compass. The brass was warm from her body, smooth from her years of handling it, the crystal face worn slightly foggy at one edge. She turned it in her fingers and watched the needle find its bearing, with the patient certainty it always had, regardless of where she was standing or how far she had come from the last place she had known. Even when the river bends, her father had said, the river had bent considerably. It had gone underground entirely, in fact, and changed direction, and dried up, and left behind a desert with a buried ship in it, and she had arrived with almost nothing and built something real. She had taken a ledger entry in the operating costs column and turned it into a name above a door. She had taken a dead captain's hope and made it into a working place where people found rest and repair and the satisfaction of things being made right. The needle pointed north. It always pointed north. Not because north was where she was going. She was not going anywhere. She was exactly where she intended to be. But because knowing north was how you kept your bearings when everything around you was unfamiliar, how you held on to the fact of direction when direction was the only certainty available. She had her bearings. She went inside to the captain's cabin that was now her office and her private sitting room, with its fire burning low in the small stove and its lamp casting its warm circle across the polished desk. She set the compass on the corner of the desk beside the carved wooden bird, her father's instrument beside Captain Cross's keepsake. One guide to direction and one reminder of what made a place worth finding your way to. She sat in the captain's chair, its wood worn smooth by decades of use, and she looked at the two small objects on the desk's corner, the brass and the driftwood, the compass and the bird. And she thought that between them they contained most of what she had learned in 20 years about how to be a person in the world. Know your heading. Know what you love. Keep faith with both, even when the river bends, even when the river disappears entirely, even when you find yourself sitting at the bottom of a buried ship in the middle of a desert with $5 and a deed, and the specific stubborn conviction that something broken is not the same as something lost. She had arrived in Drywell with $70 and the intention to spend it on an impossible object. She had found 3,000 more, and a community, and a purpose, and the morning coffee with an old carpenter, and the particular satisfaction of knowing her own name in the owner's column of a ledger she kept herself. May Calloway had spent $70 on a sunken steamship 50 miles from the nearest navigable water. It was the best $70 she ever spent. It had bought her more than she had known how to want back in that dusty land office with 7 crisp bills on Cecil Drummond's desk, and a skeptical man in a green eyeshade looking at her like she was the punchline of a very long joke. It had bought her a home, a community, a purpose carried forward across 2 decades from a dead captain's hidden drawer. A line of fidelity she had not known she was stepping into until she was already inside it. It had bought her a life that was entirely, unmistakably her own. Outside, the Nevada night pressed its cold and starry face against the pilot house windows. Below, the town of Drywell held its small fires. The workshop lamp was still moving. Jonas would close up soon, would come up through the hatch, would pour himself the last of the evening's coffee, and they would sit for a few minutes in the common room in companionable silence before he went back down to his living space between the boilers, where he had lived for 19 years and where he seemed for the first time to be living rather than merely keeping watch. The compass sat on the desk. The bird sat beside it. The fire settled in the small stove with a sound like a quiet breath. May picked up her pen, opened the business ledger to tomorrow's page, and wrote the date at the top in her clear, even hand. She drew the columns. She was ready for whatever the day would bring. Whoever would come up the gangplank with their broken things and their need for rest, whatever the desert would offer to the woman who had learned at last that knowing your heading was not about knowing the destination. It was about trusting that the compass was true and moving anyway and building something real in whatever place the river had left you.